Hey everyone, welcome. You sent us some really intense stuff this time. We're going to do a deep dive into the impact of problematic online content and, most importantly, how people can get out of that trap.
Yeah. This is definitely a sensitive topic and one that, well, the sources you gave us, I mean, they include a really insightful talk with a doctor, and they really, I think they give us a path forward,
Yeah.
recognizing the difficulties, but also the hope for recovery.
So we're going to try to break down the core issues, look at the consequences this can have, and also look at those paths toward positive change. It's not just doom and gloom. So ready to jump in.
Absolutely. One thing that's pretty alarming right off the bat is how early this exposure starts. With easy internet access everywhere, kids are bound to come across it, even by accident. It's not always intentional.
And what really stuck out to me from what you sent over? It's how that early experience, wanting to stop but not being able to, it plants this seed that it's impossible. Like it's a trap you can't escape.
Yeah, for sure. And one huge obstacle is how we tend to see this as a moral failing. That kind of judgment just slams the door on having open conversations about it, right?
Yeah.
It makes it really tough to even think about asking for help.
It's interesting, though, because while the morality of it might be a big focus in our culture, the struggle itself crosses those lines. The material you shared, it makes it clear that people from all walks of life, different beliefs and everything, they're dealing with this silently.
And that lack of open dialogue, that judgment, it creates a crisis, honestly. People feel so alone, so ashamed. And often the only time they reach out is when things are falling apart, like when their marriage is on the line.
This is where things get really fascinating, I think. The discussion we read, it stresses moving away from just seeing this as a moral issue and instead recognizing it as a potential compulsion. And that shift, it opens up the door to finding real support and strategies that actually work.
So why is it so darn hard to break free? The sources say it's often because people try to stop using methods that don't work because they don't really understand the forces they're up against, you know?
And that fear of judgment, that stigma, it's a huge weight. It keeps so many people from talking to the people who could help, family, friends, even professionals who could offer support.
Yeah, it's like a vicious cycle. Secrecy and isolation just make that feeling of hopelessness grow stronger. It's like you're trapped. And the sources, they talk about the peculiar advantages this type of content has.
Peculiar advantages. That sounds a little strange. What makes them so peculiar?
Well, they break it down right. Secrecy, low cost, it's available everywhere, and the increasing social acceptance, unfortunately. And of course, it's tied to a basic human drive, sexual desire. All of that together creates a really powerful draw.
The whole landscape around this has definitely changed a lot, hasn't it? Social acceptance has grown. It's even being discussed more openly in mainstream media in some places.
You're right. And the sources even argue that promoting solo sexual activity in general, even without specifically mentioning this kind of content, it can indirectly contribute to the problem. It normalizes certain behaviors and feeds the demand, in a way.
There's actually a really interesting historical point made in the sources. Before the mid-20th century, this stuff was hard to find publicly. Then certain publications popped up, and the argument is the idea of sexual liberation, maybe unintentionally, was used to justify this shift.
Right. And then we saw it go from print to adult cinemas, then to home video, which made it even more private, and then the internet. The sources call it a catastrophe because of how accessible it is, how much there is. It's never ending.
And the industry is massive, right? Billions of dollars, even back in the 2000s in the U.S. alone. It's a huge economic force, and they want to keep growing, of course.
They actually say, and this really got me thinking, they say human being plus internet addiction. The argument is unlimited access plus how stimulating online content is creates this perfect storm for compulsive behavior.
Okay, so we've seen how people get caught. Now let's talk about the porn trap. What does that really mean for someone who feels stuck in it?
It's that feeling of being trapped, unable to break free even when you want to. It can be terrifying.
And something else that's scary is how often kids are exposed to this accidentally. The sources say it's not a matter of if it'll happen, but when.
Yeah. The stat they give is that a huge percentage of kids just browsing the internet, they come across this stuff without meaning to. It's everywhere.
It makes you wonder about blocking access, right? The sources do mention that blocking this kind of content could really help protect kids, especially in those early years when they're most vulnerable.
It's really important because the average age of first exposure, around 9 to 11, even younger sometimes, that's a critical time in development, and it can have a huge impact.
The sources also talk about softcore versus hardcore. Can you explain the difference?
So basically, hardcore shows explicit sexual acts between people who are naked.
Hmm.
Softcore is less direct, maybe suggestive dancing or nudity, but not the actual act.
It's interesting, they quote a judge who said, "It's hard to define exactly, but you know it when you see it." And that can be so different for a kid, right? Something that seems mild to an adult could be really disturbing for a child.
And, we can't ignore how society has changed. Social acceptance has shifted a lot. The sources compare it to how views on clothing have changed. It shows how much norms can evolve.
They argue that sex has become so commercialized, it's everywhere in our daily lives, it's harder and harder to avoid.
And it's not just society. Family plays a role too. Both strict and neglectful parenting can make kids more vulnerable. Strictness can push them to find secret outlets, and neglect, well, they're unsupervised, it can lead to trouble.
The good news is there are parental control tools out there. Parents can use them to help manage what their kids are exposed to.
But there's also a big problem. Not enough education about the risks in schools. A lot of young people are just not prepared to deal with this stuff online.
So let's shift gears to relationships. The material you shared, it talks about how unhealthy family relationships can distort what people think relationships should be like. They might end up seeking comfort or escape in this online world.
And it can become this downward spiral. The more isolated someone gets, the more they might turn to online content, which makes them even more isolated, and so on.
That's why healthy relationships are so important. Real human connection can help break that cycle. The sources really emphasize that.
You need both. Those casual connections and deeper relationships and healthy boundaries in all of them, building a support system in real life, that's key.
There's also a point about absent parents, especially for boys. It can lead to all sorts of problems, including being more susceptible to this issue. Having positive role models is crucial.
Now, one thing the sources really want to debunk is the idea that this is just a male problem. It's not. The rates among women, especially young women, are on the rise.
They even talk about a specific book on how common this is among women. It's much more widespread than people might think.
And the sources suggest that women might actually feel more guilt and shame because of the stereotype that it's a guy thing. That makes it even harder to ask for help.
And one thing that really stood out is how often this content shows women being degraded and exploited. That adds another layer of harm, especially for women who might internalize those messed up portrayals. This brings us to how online content shapes our views. The sources talk about how women are often objectified, and this can really mess with self-esteem, leading to body image issues, even harmful behaviors.
It's important to remember this content is fantasy. A lot of it is based on unrealistic, unattainable ideals. Even the way the performers look, they've often had work done. It's not real life.
There's even a story about someone turning to online content because of their partner's weight. It shows how distorted our perceptions can become, these impossible standards.
And we have to talk about the exploitation in the industry itself, how the performers are treated, potential coercion. It's not always what it seems.
The sources also mention mirror neurons, how just seeing something can normalize it in our minds. It can influence our attitudes and behaviors without us even realizing it.
And this has a big impact on relationships. The sources explain how this kind of content can twist our ideas about intimacy, making it all about the physical, creating these crazy expectations.
It was alarming to read that users often start to see their real-life partners as less attractive, less intelligent, less everything, because they're comparing them to these idealized online images.
It's so damaging. It devalues real relationships, makes it hard to connect on a deeper level, to be vulnerable, which is what real intimacy needs, right? Not just the physical stuff.
The sources talk about how both online content and real intimacy release dopamine, but in different ways. The rush from the online stuff is more intense, quicker, and it can make your brain crave that over real connection.
And there's actually research linking this kind of content to lower sexual satisfaction in real relationships. There's even a potential link to higher divorce rates. It's not just happening in your head, it has real-world consequences.
And it affects more than just romance. The sources say users can become more angry and irritable, maybe because of that inner conflict, that disconnect between online and real life.
And don't forget the time it sucks up. All that time and energy that could be going into real relationships, it gets wasted. It's like a slow poison.
Another big thing is sleep. The sources talk about how it impacts sleep quality, and that can lead to all kinds of other physical and mental problems. It just makes everything worse.
This content can be so deceptive. It promises to fix things like loneliness, but it ends up making them worse. It's a trap.
And the sources link it to things like social anxiety, fear of intimacy, and lower self-confidence, all of those things make it harder to build those real-life connections we need.
But the good news is there's hope. It starts with recognizing there's a problem. That's the first step.
It can be a long and difficult journey, but it's worth it. The sources make it clear that recovery is possible. You can regain that hope and confidence.
They even share some incredible stories about people who have overcome this and achieved great things in their lives. It's a powerful message of hope.
They really emphasize how important support is, finding communities and people who understand.
Yeah, peer support groups, structured programs that give guidance and keep you accountable. They often include things like goal setting, tracking progress, and they focus on living a more balanced and fulfilling life.
The sources say it's not just about stopping the behavior, but replacing it with healthy things that make you feel good, breaking bad habits, and building a better life.
Learning to manage those triggers is crucial. Things like stress, boredom, loneliness, they can lead you back to those old habits. The sources suggest finding alternative activities, changing your lifestyle, hobbies, exercise, social interaction.
Real-life connections are so important. Having a good support system can make a huge difference.
Family and friends can be great, but sometimes you need professional help too. A therapist or counselor can provide the right guidance and strategies.
So the message is clear. Acknowledge the problem. Work to stop. Replace those negative patterns with positive ones and build a good life.
You gave us some really important stuff to think about. These sources, they give us a deep understanding of this issue, and most importantly, they show that positive change is possible with awareness, support, and effort.
We really hope you'll reflect on what we've discussed. This has a big impact on individuals and on society. So what do you think people can do to build healthier relationships with online content, and how can we support those who are trying to make a change?